Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. South Korea's opposition-led National Assembly impeached acting President Han Duck-soo, further deepening the country's political crisis. Washington resumed high-level diplomatic dialogue with South Korea's interim government. Today, we look at how the U.S. and South Korea can remain in lockstep to maintain security and stability in the region.
Deep belief in the democracy and the constitutional provisions in the country.
And what will unfold in Korea from now on will follow the democratic procedure.
This 北東アジアの情勢について認識をいつにするということは大事なことだと思っております。
I think the United States should and probably very likely come to South Korea's defense consistent with withholding our capability in case the Chinese move.
In the studio with me, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Asia Pacific Security Chair at the Hudson Institute. Dr. Cronin previously served as Senior Director of the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. Also joining us, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner spent 20 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency and served as CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Now, Dr. Cronin, Mr. Klingner, South Korea's opposition-led National Assembly impeached the Prime Minister, acting President Han Duck-soo, and Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok assumed the position. Now, this comes as the United States just resumed high-level engagement with South Korea's interim government. And when the impeachment motion against Han was introduced at the National Assembly, the State Department told VOA that we're ready to work with acting President Han and the ROK government. Now, how does the latest development in Seoul impact the Seoul-Washington policy coordination?
Well, there's no getting around that there's a political crisis in South Korea, and this is complicating U.S.-South Korean relations. But the United States will adjust. If this is the political process that South Korea goes down, and now we have a new acting president in Che, I think there's no alternative but to deal with him. And he's already indicated he wants to be a stabilizing force. And meanwhile, there'll probably be a protest against this latest impeachment of the acting President Han. So maybe he'll be reinstated. Who knows? But I think either way, the United States has to be prepared to deal with the constitutionally authorized leadership of South Korea.
The U.S. will work with whatever leaders in front of the curtain. In the meantime, the bureaucracies, the military, the intelligence community, the diplomats will all be working with their counterparts. So the relationship will remain very stable, but the turmoil is at the leadership level. And now I think we've gone beyond political turmoil to really political vindictiveness in that going after acting President Han seems to be, I think, a bridge too far taken by the opposition party.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Cronin, doesn't it give instability to the bilateral policy coordination when the leadership keeps on changing in Korea because they're being impeached?
Well, we've had 3 Korean leaders in a fortnight, so yes, this is an unstable time in South Korea. There's no, again, avoiding the fact that we're in a political crisis, and that is a severe blow to the U.S.-South Korean alliance, but it's temporary. And meanwhile, as Bruce suggests, the officials are still talking to each other at very important levels on defense, on intelligence, on business. So policy goes on. And I was just spent a week in Korea this last week, and I must say things were very calm and operational despite the large protests on the street.
Now, Dr. Cronin, demonstrations supporting and opposing President Yoon Suk-yeol continue in Seoul, and recent week the United States expressed appreciation and support for the democratic resiliency in South Korea. Now, When South Korean public opinion is deeply polarized, in the eyes of the United States, which sides represents democracy? Does the majority represent democracy? And as new chapters unfold in this play, would Washington question which sides actually represents democracy?
Well, we have political polarization in the United States as well, but not as severe at the moment as in South Korea. There's a 1948 Constitution. It's been amended 8 times. Or 9 times, and as a result, there's a very strong commitment in South Korea's constitution to democratic principles, to a directly elected president. So Americans are going to be mostly focusing on, are the South Koreans following their own constitution? And does it seem to be fair? Does it pass the smell test about what they're doing? So the impeachment against acting President Han, I think if more Americans looked at it, would say, what are they doing? Maybe they did overreach. But the impeachment of President Yoon, it garnered the 200, more than 200 votes, more than 2/3 of the legislature. So as a result, that is democracy at work. And we're following this constitutional process. It is resilient, it is strong, and we have to stick with it. Again, I was just in Korea, and I was impressed with the order of Korea. Despite the protests themselves were orderly, on both sides. They were strong, but they were both orderly. And I think that's a good sign for South Korean democracy. We're going to get through this.
And Mr. Klingner, in the lens of U.S. national interest, do external threats to South Korea outweigh criticism of the martial law declaration? And based on your long years at the CIA, has the U.S. been able to differentiate between legitimate pluralism against populism in Korea?
Well, the U.S. and South Korea obviously have had a very long relationship, a formal alliance, as well as critically important diplomatic and economic partners, not only in the Northeast Asia, but really now more on a global scale. So we have many lanes in the road. So clearly the North Korean threat and the China threat are of great interest and importance to both countries. And the militaries and the intelligence communities are working, and they're very vigilant against any kind of activity that North Korea may take to try to take advantage of it. Though I think North Korea is more likely to just sit back and reap the benefits of the turmoil that is going on in South Korea. The U.S. will be seeing that the democracy is working right now in South Korea. It's quite messy at the moment, but we're seeing that the system is working, that there's no violence going on in the streets. It is all very orderly. The process is working in the National Assembly, though now with the latest developments against acting President Han, I think it becomes less clear that the system is working. But there will be contention over that action, as well as continued political debate amongst all the various impeachments that have already been in work, let alone those against President Yoon and acting President Han. But the U.S. is going to step back and just not try to get involved in domestic political issues with a very important partner.
But you talked about how U.S. and South Korea has long history together as an alliance. Hasn't there been in the past instances where U.S. really had to think hard about whether this is in U.S. national interest or whether this is going through democratic procedures?
Well, before democratization in Korea, the U.S. had a relationship, an alliance with military dictatorships, authoritarian regimes, but we didn't sever relations, we didn't sever the alliance. We would perhaps work behind the scenes to try to encourage democratization, but any criticism generally tended to be quieter and behind the scenes, because diplomacy is not one size fits all. You may be more critical of a non-partner taking actions than you would be of an important partner, but that doesn't mean that behind the scenes, stern messages aren't being shared. So I think with martial law and the impeachment of President Yoon, there was a lot of activity between Washington and Seoul behind the scenes. Some criticize Washington for not being more publicly critical of President Yoon's actions, but I think given that it was so short-lived, there was really uncertainty as to what was happening at the time. And by the time we had a sense of what was going on, the martial law had been rescinded, and therefore the U.S., I think, didn't have to step in with such critical commentary as if the martial law had continued.
And Mr. Klingner, Korean business leaders and political leaders are meeting with President Trump's aides. The anti-Yoon political camp in Korea has long pursued a policy of deference to China and hostility towards Japan and skepticism to certain aspects of U.S.-South Korea alliance, whereas pro-Yoon camp prioritizes the U.S.-ROK alliance and cooperation with Japan and stand up to China as being a very pragmatic president. Wouldn't Trump be weighing which side serves more U.S. interest?
Well, the Trump administration, like the Biden administration, will have to engage with whoever the leader is. And I think if there's a constitutional court upholding of the impeachment of Yoon and then there's an election, I think it's almost assured that the opposition would win and therefore would implement very different foreign policies than President Yoon. So it's a very different scene than the Trump administration might have expected just a few months ago. So the Trump administration will have to react to whatever leader is there. There will be strong differences between a DP, Democratic Party government, and the Trump administration over China. I think everyone in Washington right now is a China hawk. It's just a matter of degrees. So the DP government would be very opposed to that. They want to be very conciliatory towards China. There may be greater alignment on North Korea policy than under a Yoon administration because the DP would be more favorable to any kind of diplomatic outreach by the Trump administration towards Pyongyang. So, and then the alliance, I think there could be some strains in that relationship.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Cronin, as Mr. Klingner just said, the possible DP government may have very different views about China compared to the China hawks in Washington. Wouldn't that become a repeat of a Trump first administration and the rocky relationship that it had with the Moon Jae-in administration?
Well, to some extent it could be that, but I think it will be different this time. I mean, even on North Korea policy, if President Trump in the second term acts more unilaterally and without consulting Seoul, this could still be an issue of discord between the U.S. and South Korea. There was a lot of work done in the first Trump term to try to keep alignment on the search for disarmament and for peace. And it wasn't always perfect, but at least they did coordinate. This time it could be difficult with this impeachment. It depends on how this election goes, if there is a special election in the spring or summer in Korea. I do think on other issues on China, it also is different. I think the Trump policy on China will be much harder line in terms of trying to look for maximum pressure on China. It doesn't mean there won't be bargaining and negotiation, but I don't think Xi Jinping is looking for a grand bargain, and I think as a result, Trump's going to keep ramping up the pressure, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on Seoul to either go along with the United States or accommodate us, or stake out a very difficult position. And I think this means tension ahead for U.S.-South Korean relations.
So Dr. Cronin, Mr. Klingner mentioned there's a lot of China hawks in Washington now. Given Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung's past comments, how he has shown pro-China stance, if there's a possibility that he could become a president, and do you think there could be some warning signs to Washington in his actions and his words?
Well, there are a lot of steps to go before Lee Jae-myung might become president of South Korea. He still has 5 pending legal cases that he'd have to make sure that he's qualified to be the candidate if indeed the impeachment's upheld by the Constitutional Court and then there's a special election and the Democratic Party prevails in that election. But yeah, there will be warning signs along the way, but so far, I think Lee Jae-myung has already indicated a softening of his position, so he's trying clearly to do at least the minimum diplomacy necessary to reassure Washington that he would be a capable alliance partner, even while he has disagreements on how to pursue policies with China, how to pursue engagement with North Korea, how to pursue trilateral relations or not pursue trilateral relations with Japan.
And Mr. Klingner, we've seen that action from the opposition party in the impeachment motion against President Yoon. In the first impeachment motion, they put a wording about criticizing President Yoon's foreign policy, and then they took it out in the second impeachment motion, and Lee Jae-myung endorsed the U.S.-ROK alliance. But aren't there many factions within the Democratic Party which does raise concerns in Washington?
Exactly. There are differences of views within the DP. And also, I think some moderation, which I think is more for public consumption than an actual softening of their policies. as you point out, the first impeachment motion included, political differences or policy differences, where I think that reveals the true thinking of the DP more than the second impeachment motion, which was focused more on constitutional violations by President Yoon. So I think that was very revealing in the first impeachment motion, where they harshly criticized President Yoon for his bizarre or strange policy, as it was written, and very critical of what they said was the traitorous policies towards Japan. So I think on China, they want to be much more conciliatory. Lee Jae-myung talked of we should be thanking China for its actions in the Indo-Pacific, that South Korea should have no role in any kind of Taiwan contingency, when the U.S. is going to be looking for greater involvement by our Indo-Pacific allies and partners to be moving against China's coercive actions in the Indo-Pacific. Also, undoing the bilateral relations between Seoul and Tokyo, or trilateralism, also goes against U.S. strategic interests. So, there may be a bit of alignment on North Korea policy if President Trump wants to re-engage with Kim. He doesn't need to go through Seoul this time. He already has established a relationship. So in that case, the DP may just sit back and hope that there will be a lessening of tensions. But the real issue is whether any kind of agreement between the U.S. and North Korea actually reduces the threat rather than just tries to make, diplomatic, success, at least or the appearance of it.
And I want to look more in depth about the incoming Trump administration. Dr. Cronin, can you give us a preview of the specific list that President Trump may ask of South Korea?
Well, the first thing is we need you to do more, period. So it's not something as specific as let's renegotiate the special measures agreement that was rushed through at the end of the Biden administration, but it's rather everything is on the table. We need you to help more on high technology policy. We need you to reduce the trade imbalance that's actually gone more in South Korea's favor. We need you to do more, not just on North Korea, but we need you to do more in helping us on China. And if the Democratic Party is in power in Seoul next summer, and we're asking Seoul to do more on China, as Bruce has suggested, that could be a problem. And I think that's really the sticking point. Now, maybe if Lee Jae-myung comes to power, he could probably appeal to someone like Elon Musk, if he's still around, and try to say, wait, we need to appeal to the business side and the technology side, because we actually have common interests in making sure that we're bringing China into the international manufacturing and value chain, that we both rely on.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Klingner, President Trump named Mr. Elbridge Colby as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. And as a frequent panelist on Washington Talk, Mr. Colby repeatedly said that South Korea should do more in defending itself, and that U.S. forces Korea should be rearranged to defend against China. Many believe Mr. Colby's view, coupled with President Trump's America First policy, may lead to adjustment in the size and the role of the USFK, and also renegotiation of the Special Measures Agreement. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to preface anything with we don't know what the Trump administration's policies will be. We don't know how much the previous statements by people who are now going into the administration reflect what the president will do. That said, there certainly has been concern in Tokyo and Seoul the last several years if there is a second Trump administration, given the actions of the first, where during the special measures agreement with both countries, there was a push to make a profit off of our sons and daughters in uniform. There were threats to reduce our forces, not over strategic differences or strategic strategies, but over compensation for their deployment there. So there has been that concern. Now, as Patrick said, there is also now, I think, a bipartisan push for our allies in the region to do more against China. That is very different from during the first Trump administration, where of course there was concern about China, but now it really is being seen as an existential threat to the United States, a multifaceted threat. So that will be the predominant driver, I think, in Indo-Pacific strategy. And there has been unhappiness, particularly by the Trump administration, over our allies and partners not doing enough in the Indo-Pacific. Both Tokyo and Seoul promised to do more, and I think they have been doing more. But it's, there's going to be a push for not only do more, but do it faster and more expansively.
And Dr. Cronin, more than any other policymakers in Washington, Mr. Colby was open to the idea of South Korea getting its own nuclear weapons. Aren't people around President Trump share this realist kind of view as Mr. Colby? And do you think there's a possibility that President Trump's 2016 comment about the possibility of Japan and South Korea getting their own nuclear weapons, that could be further developed under the second Trump administration? And also the possibility that USFK could be downsized and nuclear deterrence could be strengthened to be more cost effective?
Well, we're dealing with a lot of speculation at a very difficult time. Let me just start with, say, the new Senate leaders who are going to matter so much. Senators Wicker and Risch, who have now been named as the Senate Armed Services and Foreign Affairs Committee chairs in January when the Republicans are the majority in Senate. I think that they're very important players in this. They're deeply committed to extended deterrence, to making sure that we strengthen further the ability of the United States nuclear umbrella to guarantee the security of South Korea working through this alliance. And they're willing to think about the reintroduction of nuclear weapons to the peninsula, for instance. I think those are steps that are more likely to happen than South Korea suddenly being sort of giving the green light to go off and get a nuclear weapon on its own. But I don't think those pressures stop in South Korea. That is, South Korea now has a long-term challenge. How do we South Koreans ultimately deter on our own North Korea's nuclear weapons arsenal, especially if it keeps building up, and if the Americans suddenly change their mind and reduce their commitment? And I think that's where this issue is still going to carry on. But I don't think Undersecretary Bridge Colby, if he's confirmed, as I think he will be leading with this issue. But I can also see him saying, let's put everything on the table. Let's study this issue. I do know that people who are likely to go into the second Trump administration beyond Bridge Colby are very committed to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They're saying the United States has benefited a great deal from the NPT regime. The NPT regime was broken, but at the same time, just because, as Bridge Colby has said in the past, North Korea, China, Russia have been helped more than we have, and our allies have been by this regime, it doesn't mean that you can't adapt and try to strengthen that regime while we strengthen extended deterrence. But this is all going to happen in the context of putting more pressure on South Korea to do more, not because South Korea hasn't done a lot, and not because it doesn't spend a lot on defense. It's just because the challenges are bigger, and we need more help to deal with a growing, assertive China. And so that's the reality, and I think we're going to have to manage this together, and unless we can manage this together, we're going to both be hurt in terms of our fundamental interests. So we have to manage this together. Bridge Colby will manage this together. I believe in his strategic acumen, whatever he has said in the past, to make sure that U.S. and South Korean strategic leaders of any party are working in alignment.
And Mr. Klingner, considering President Trump is a skeptic about alliance, the U.S., South Korea, Japan trilateral cooperation, would that be weakened when compared to President Biden? Or would President Trump see value in that, in counterbalancing against China?
Well, we wonder how much to extrapolate from the first term. Is during the first term, there was less emphasis on the U.S. playing a behind-the-scenes role in trying to bring about reconciliation between Seoul and Tokyo. It was seen more as that's their issue, they have to deal with it, overcome the historic and sovereignty disputes. There was greater behind-the-scenes actions under the Obama and Biden administrations. So we don't know how much that will be extrapolated.
And just briefly, Dr. Cronin, Congressional Research Service report says that the suspension of President Yoon's authorities raised questions about the staying power of his foreign policy. Would the Trump administration agree with the foreign policy direction of Korean progressives?
Well, the Congressional Research Service does great work, and I happen to agree with that general assessment that we have lost the moment on what has been a rising, ascending trajectory in U.S.-Korean relations, including trilateral relations with Japan. We haven't necessarily lost all of the benefits, but we're not going to be rising anymore. We're sort of in a stalemate. We have to protect what we've already negotiated. I think we do have to worry about progressive policies in Seoul undermining our core foreign policy interests, even while we respect the democratic process and the Constitution of South Korea.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Klingner, Dr. Cronin, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.